Hello and welcome everybody to this online LSE public event. Thank you for joining us. This is an event organized by the Hellenic Observatory and the National Bank of Greece, and it is part of the Hellenic Observatory's Athens Lecture Series and the LSE Public Events program. We're meeting today to discuss issues that relate to the rise of populism, but also economic decline, inequality in the US, but also more generally across the globe. The title for our event is Golfing with Trump, Economic Decline, Inequality, and the Rise of Populism in the US. The event will have a form of a presentation by our keynote speaker, Professor Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, and then we have two distinguished discussants who will follow the presentation before we open to questions and answers with you in the audience. I'll give a few details about how the event will play out, but first let me introduce our speakers. Our keynote speaker, Professor Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, is Professor of Economic Geography here at the London School of Economics. He has a long track record of research on a range of issues in regional analysis, regional growth and disparities, fiscal and political decentralization, on regional innovation, development, policies, development strategies, but more recently has been contributing very centrally on the debates about the role of institutions for economic development, as well as on the debate about the rise of populism and events that happen across the globe. He is also the new director here at LSE at the Cañada Blanche Center, and among his many accolades, he includes the 2018 Regional Science Award by the European Regional Science Association, one of the highest awards in the field worldwide. He is advisor to various international organizations, including the European Commission, the World Bank, and the European Investment Bank, as well as different United Nations agencies, including the ILO and the FAO. He's going to talk to us, as I said, on the topic, and then he will be followed by our two discussants. The first of our discussants is Professor Dimitris Kairidis, who is a member of the Greek Parliament, representing the Athens North for the Centre-Right Party of New Democracy. He is a professor of international politics at Panteion University in Athens and the founding director of the Navarino Network in Thessaloniki. He has taught in many universities in Greece as well as internationally, and he's a regular TV political commentator. He has published extensively in international politics, including books on nationalism and ethnic conflict, US foreign policy, and others. Our second discussant is Professor Antigone Lyberaki, Professor of Economics at Panteion University of Social and Political Sciences in Athens. Professor Lyberaki was educated in Athens University and at the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex University, and she has taught also abroad at City University of New York and in Paris as well. Her research interests have focused on the interplay between social structures and economic performance, and she has published extensively and participated in civil society initiatives related to women's rights, migration, and development. Before I pass on the floor to our speakers, just a couple of organizational stuff. For those of you using the Twitter, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Trump, one word. I should also mention that the event, the online event, is being recorded and will be made available, if everything works, hopefully as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties with the system. As I said, after our presentations and the discussions, there will be a chance for you to put questions. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be submitted to myself, and I will try to gather as many questions and pose them to the speakers for the discussion. For those watching the event live on Facebook, please add them as comments on your Facebook page. I will now I will let you know when I open the floor for questions and answers, but let me now move to our keynote speaker, Andrés Rodríguez-Pose. The floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Vasilis. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm going to share my screen right now and see if this works. Let me just, hopefully it will come. Yeah, it just came. There it is. Okay, so thank you very much to the Hellenic Observatory and to the National Bank of Greece to have me here in a virtual form. It would have been nice to be live in Athens or in London, but unfortunately we all have to be on computer screens. And what I'm going to try to talk to you today is about a topic that has become very topical. We are in an election period. Within now a month, we'll have either a confirmed president or a new president of the United States. And the question here is, we have a very unusual president. We have a president that is like no other before, one that has thrives in a rhetoric that is very close to that of the anti-system and populist type of approach that has been emerging in many parts of the world, and especially in the developed world over the last few years. And what I'm going to try to explain is to what extent was his election rooted in long-term economic and social issues within the United States? To what extent was it linked to the rise of inequality and levels of inequality? And to what extent was it linked to factors like a dwindling social capital, as has been highlighted in the past, and how those factors have been long-lasting factors and may, to a large, in a certain way, influence the current election that is underway. So let me start by the prediction that was made by one of our colleagues in the United States, one of our most prestigious social science colleagues, Robert Putnam, in what is probably one of the seminal books in social sciences in this 21st century. In 2000, Robert Putnam published Bowling Alone. And in this book, Bowling Alone, he predicted to a certain extent a decline of American power, a decline of the American economy, but especially a decline of democracy linked to one fundamental factor. And that was that Americans were increasingly not bowling with friends in clubs, but they were bowling alone. And bowling alone was taken as a metaphor for a decline in civic engagement and political participation and all other forms of social capital that had been the bulwark of American prosperity since almost independence, but had witnessed a turning point since the mid-1960s. And this wane in engagement in bowling clubs was just a metaphor for a decline in all sorts of other forms of civic engagement and social trust, like political participation, voter turnout, newspaper readership, letter writing, union membership, church attendance, club meetings, volunteering, or any other sort of this type of dominating civic engagement. This coincided with another important factor, which was a rise in inequality. The United States, within the developed world, is a country that has relatively limited levels of territorial inequality, but has high levels of interpersonal inequality. But the level of interpersonal inequality had been declining in the US, especially since the end of the Second World War until the late 1960s, early 1970s. However, since the late 1960s, the trend changed, and there was an increasing polarization, with a few receiving the lion's share of the returns of economic activity, whereas a large percentage, or an ever larger percentage, of Americans losing out. And when you combine rising interpersonal inequality with declining social capital, that was, for Putnam, the biggest threat to democracy. He says that in his book on page 28, that our economy, our democracy, and even our health and happiness depend on adequate stocks of social capital, and those were declining together with inequality. What I'm going to be arguing here today is that, yes, there was probably a threat looming in the horizon already in 2000 to US democratic health. And that maybe social capital and interpersonal inequality played a part. But what I'm going to argue is that there was a third factor that was under the radar, that was not noticed by Robert Putnam, and has been basically unnoticed by the majority of social science scientists in the US and elsewhere, which has been linked to a long-term, very prolonged economic and demographic decline of American towns and rural areas, and the related rise in territorial inequality. And that this combination, together with remnants of the strong social capital, not weaker social capital, as Putnam highlighted, has led to a geography of discontent, as has been highlighted by Phil McCann, especially for the case of Europe, but to a politics of resentment that we probably saw to a large extent on the debate yesterday, as highlighted by Kathy Kremer, that has led to a revenge of these places that increasingly are regarded as not to matter in a more globalized, integrated, contemporary world. So let me just start by highlighting, has the prediction by Robert Putnam that American democracy was in jeopardy been fulfilled? And of course, this would depend to a large extent on your political views. But many would argue that the November 2016 election of Donald Trump as President of the United States represented that threat to democracy. Donald Trump was an outsider with a clear populist sort of rhetoric that first managed to get elected in the primaries of the Republican Party against the mainstream Republican candidates by beating every single one of them, and then against all odds won the election in November 2016 and became president. And he mainly won the election by, you can take a look at the map over here, by getting a massive swing of votes, not getting the electoral vote, but getting the actual vote in specific states that swung, and those states are states like Wisconsin, states like Michigan, Ohio, or Pennsylvania, that are long-term declining states, and those were the ones that gave Donald Trump the presidency. The question is why? Why did it happen? And what I'm going to try to argue that there are several factors. Let's go first to the factors that were highlighted by Robert Putnam. The first one is this erosion of social capital, this dwindling social capital that in fact was taking place for a long time under the radar, and that was undermining this declining social capital, the performance of democratic institutions in the US. The idea that lower trust, lower connectedness, and lower civic engagement were actually gnawing slowly the pillars of American democracy. The second, and what we can see is if we map this type of social capital highlighted by Putnam in the US, and this is the map of social capital in 2014, what we see here is that there are parts of the US with relatively low levels of social capital. This is, for example, the case of most of the South, states like Kentucky or Tennessee with very low levels of social capital, but also across the Southwest of the United States, in Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, or Nevada, or Southern California, where social capital is notoriously low, together with the big cities. So you can see in around New York or in many parts of the megalopolis towards Washington, but also Los Angeles, where social capital is lower than in the rest of the country, and a high concentration basically in the Great Plains, all the way from northern Texas to the Dakotas, but also in the mountain states from Wyoming to Montana and Idaho. The second factor would be interpersonal inequality and the polarization of American society that has been a constant, not just in the US, but has been a constant as highlighted by many economists and other social scientists like Raj Chetty, Thomas Piketty, Branko Milanovic, Danny Dorling, for example, in parts of the US, but also most of Europe and most of the developed world, that has facilitated in a certain way or created an economic insecurity, a large army of individuals that have been left behind, that are much more vulnerable, and that are more likely to fall into the net of populist candidates. These people left behind, these people at risk of falling into poverty, have in many numbers or have been considered to be, when you look at the literature by political scientists, the key drivers of the rise of anti-system candidates, that those that reject the status quo and are actually eroding these democratic institutions. If we take a look at the situation of interpersonal inequality in the US, what we see is that there are parts of the US that are highly unequal. Again, the cities, you can see here New York, you can see Los Angeles, you can see the Bay Area with high levels of inequality, but also most of the south of the US, and there are relatively low levels of interpersonal inequality, especially in the Midwest and around the Great Lakes, but also in some of the mountain states. And the final factor, before I get to the final factor, is the third factor, is that there would be a combination of both. That when you have, on the one hand, low social capital and high inequality, you are creating, according to Putnam, the conditions for this threat to American democracy. The third factor is that I think has been somewhat neglected, but is as important, if not more important, is that while Putnam's work is about all sorts of declines, from decline in social capital and civic engagement and political participation and voter turnout, one decline that has been very important, that has inspired songwriters and writers and poets for quite a few decades now, but unfortunately has not been as inspiring for scientists, is that of Midtown and rural America. This idea that what you have is the communities that built America, that was built to a large extent on places like Youngstown, Ohio, Allentown, Pennsylvania, areas that had a strong people rooted in the community, that were dynamic, that were industrial centers in the Industrial Revolution, have been losing population, they have been losing wealth, and they have been losing employment for quite a few decades. And this type of decline is leading to a situation in which these places that increasingly count for less and less in economic terms, but also in social terms, in the construct of this idea of the United States, are reacting, and they are reacting at the moment at the ballot box. And this is something that is not just exclusive to the US, it's something that has been studied in the UK in great detail by Phil McCann, the rise of polarization and the emergence of the shift of the red wall from Labour to the Conservatives across the whole of Europe, in the north of France, in southern Belgium, in declining towns in northern Italy, in work done by Louise Dijkstra and myself, or in the US in work done mainly by Kathy Kramer at the University of Wisconsin, and more recently last year by Jonathan Rodden at Stanford. And if you take we take a proxy, this is the decline or employment change between 1980 and 2016, what we see is that there are places in the US that have generated significant amounts of new employment, mostly along the East Coast. You can see the Northeast corridor, but also the West Coast, and many areas in the center of the US, especially outside or the areas closest, or the cities closest to the Great Lakes, but the Great Plains, for example, the axis that goes all the way from North Dakota to the Mexican border, but also many parts of the Rust Belt and the South, where the number of jobs being generated is very low. So the question here is, well, how has this long-term decline in employment, but not just in employment, in population, in wages and in earnings, affected the reaction of individuals that are losing out at the ballot box, and how can they have turned, or why would they then turn to a candidate which has been an outsider like Donald Trump, as they did in 2016? And what I'm going to argue is that this is the decline in social capital and the rise in interpersonal inequality may matter, but they may matter less. That it would be mainly long-term decline, and long-term decline associated to relatively strong social capital, especially in areas where we still have got this strong social identities and social consciousness, and in where the loss of one individual is still very much regarded as the loss for the rest of the community. Those would be the places that have driven the rise of anti-system voting in America, the places that would have elected Donald Trump as president. And this would not have had happened in places where you have high inequality but weak social ties. For example, the big cities. The big cities are the places with the highest interpersonal inequality, where you have the weakest social capital. But, for example, the richest people living in the west suburbs of Philadelphia, for example, would actually vote or would have voted in the same way for Hillary Clinton as the people living in the ghettos of northern Philadelphia, which are among the poorest of the poor in the United States. So what I'm trying to is look into these factors and try to explain how did it happen and what is the role of all these factors put together. And there's a mathematical model. I'm going to try to summarize it here in a simple, iconic way. What we're trying to measure, and I say we because this is work that I do with Neil Lee and Cornelius Lipp, we explain what we call the Trump margin. So is the excess of vote or the sway to Donald Trump in 2016 relative to the votes cast to the previous Republican candidate in 2012, Mitt Romney, who was a mainstream Republican candidate cast in the traditional way of most Republican candidates in the past. And we argue that the Trump margin might be a factor of, on the one hand, levels of social capital that we'll have at community level in the US, the analysis done at county level for more than 3,000 counties, the levels of inequality in the county, or the levels of long-term economic and demographic decline over time, controlling for the decline between 1970 and 2016. And we do this by decade. We do this between 1970 and 2016, the year of the election, 1980 and 2016, 1990, and so on, decade by decade. And we control for a number of other factors that are supposed to play a role in the election of Donald Trump. The level of wealth of the county, proxied by its GDP per capita, the race component, we control for the white population, but also the black population in the analysis, the white non-Hispanic population as well, the level of education of the population, always highlighted as a key factor in the switch to a populist vote, and a number of factors, the error term, that might have an influence in the whole process. What I'm going to show you is that in principle, no of these single factors, the three factors that we consider of interest, so change in employment, which is our first proxy for economic change over time, levels of inequality or levels of social capital, is strongly connected in any way with the Trump margin. That not a single of these factors is the only driver or the main driver of the Trump vote. There's a slightly stronger connection of employment change with Trump margin. So the places that have seen a higher level of employment growth, those around here, have tended to vote less for Trump than they actually voted for Mitt Romney in 2012. But in general, the relationship is very weak. And the relationship between the three variables of interest, inequality, employment change, or economic change in general, and social capital, is also very weak. So there's not that you can have a strong correlation and all these factors happen in just one place and not in others. So this is the first thing that we need to take into account. What happens when we put all the factors together and we do the analysis and a regression analysis and we get the results? So what I'm going to show, I'm not going to show tables. I just want to highlight, there's a paper for all of you that are interested in these topics. You can take a look. If you want to know the analysis in detail, you can get it there. What I'm going to try to summarize is that there's quite a lot of data analysis behind. The results are very robust. And what I'm going to try is to just summarize the results very quickly in an iconic way. So what determines the Trump margin once we control for everything? First, I want to say that the factors that we introduce as control matter in the way we're expected to matter. Places with a higher density, mainly the cities, tend to vote to a much lower extent for Trump than they did for Mitt Romney in 2012. So the Trump vote increases, or the Trump margin, to be more exact, increases as you get away from the most dense places, as you get away from cities into the suburbs and into the rural areas, which is something that has been highlighted very, very clearly by Jonathan Rodden. Race matters, where you have a majority of white population, where you have, there will be a higher Trump margin if you have a large percentage of majority and minority, especially if you have a large percentage of Black population. What you'll have is that the share of the Trump margin is reduced significantly in those areas. And what we find is, first, that employment decline since 1980, this is the basic model, since 1980 until 2016 is a key factor in determining the Trump margin. Then we also find that social capital matters, but I put the bowling upside down in case you have noticed, because it's not in the way that Robert Putnam expected. It's the opposite way. Stronger social capital in declining areas is a fundamental driver of the Trump margin. By contrast, we find virtually no relationship between greater inequality and the Trump margin. And if anything, there's a positive negative relationship. Places with greater inequality actually tend to vote less or have a less Trump margin. So vote less for Trump than they did for Romney. How about different types of decline? Because at the moment we have concentrated just on one, which is employment decline, but there might be other types of decline that are relevant for this reaction at the ballot box and this shift of votes, this swing of votes to Donald Trump. And what we find is that it's not just employment change, but also demographic decline, population loss is a big driver of the Trump margin. Places that have lost employment, places that have lost population, where communities remain relatively strong, are the ones that gave Trump the presidency. Places, by contrast, where you see significant decline in wages or in earnings, are not connected in any way to the Trump margin. So overall, what we find is that, and in contrast to what others and myself have found in Europe, where in Europe populism is associated to economic decline and in decline in industrial employment, in the US is not the people that lose out financially or the areas that lose out financially, but the areas that lose employment and population, the areas that have no future, that are moving towards Trump. And then the final one is, what about change over time? And the question is this just a reaction to the crisis, not the current coronavirus crisis, but the 2008 Great Recession and the years of difficulty that followed that were less important in the US than in Europe? What we find is that this is not just that the crisis might have been the trigger, but in reality, this is something that has been brewing for a long time. When we start controlling for decline since the 1970s or the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s and 2010s, it doesn't matter how long you look, employment decline and population decline are always connected to a higher Trump margin. The bigger the decline and the stronger the decline in more recent times, the stronger the connection, but nevertheless, this is an enduring process. By contrast, declining wages and in earnings are not connected in any way with a bigger shift to the vote for Trump. So let me just conclude, and I think I probably have about 2 more minutes on this. So what are the conclusions? We need to take a stock that this is a phenomenon that maybe we can think that the Trump vote and the election of Donald Trump in 2006 was a one-off. But the discontent that lies under the vote for an outsider, for a candidate that would have been deemed unelectable by any political analyst just 6 months or 8 months or a year before the election, is rooted in a deep discontent that is linked to long-term economic and demographic decline in places where you still have got a strong sense of belonging, a strong sense of participation in declining communities. So is this long-term economic and demographic decline of the tightly knit American community of Midtown America and rural areas that drove the swing to Trump and seems to be driving the rise of anti-system voting and populism in the case of the US. And this is creating a malaise that goes well beyond the recent crisis and is deeply rooted in time and is manifesting at the moment in the ballot box. These areas that for long have been declined as rust belts, as rednecks states, as flyover states, are saying, well, if we're losing out from a system that we consider is no longer fair, they are becoming angry, they are becoming resentful, and they are venting their anger at the ballot box and voting for someone that, since we don't have a future, we're going to show how it feels not to have a future that is probably going to shake the tree and shake it big time. So what I would say is that in contrast to what was predicted by Putnam, these communities are no longer bowling alone. It's not that they have lost their community spirit. Their community spirit remains, but they have decided to play with a different partner, a partner that's an outsider, and rather than bowling alone, they are now golfing with Trump. And probably we have to be careful because although now the polls are putting Joe Biden on a comfortable lead, this is a deep-rooted malaise that runs deep, and maybe many of these communities would continue to bowl or to play golf or to play ball with anyone that pays attention to their plight and that promises to reverse what have been now decades of neglect and perceived disdain. So it's difficult to make predictions at the moment, but what we have to take into account is that given the electoral system in the US, although it seems unlikely at the moment, we will need to hold our breath until the election night to see what the outcome of the election is. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrés. Thanks, excellent timekeeping as well, but thanks for a very interesting and very clear argument. We already received some questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. So before I pass the floor to our discussants, let me just briefly announce to the audience that you can indeed use the Q&A icon or button at the bottom of your screen to type your questions, and then we'll try to somehow aggregate them and pass them on to the speakers for the comments and answers. But please, if you can identify yourselves, obviously your name, but also some affiliation, so that we know also what's the context of your question. If you know, continue asking your questions, but we will go to a Q&A after the comments by our two discussants. So first in our discussants is Professor Dimitris Kairidis. Dimitri.
Okay, can you hear me, Vasilis? Am I well heard? Okay, yeah. Thank you. I think this was fascinating, and it made me feel nostalgic of academia now that I have moved to politics. And I thank Andrés for this wonderful expose, very, very useful. And it proves the importance of this dialogue between academia and serious research on the one hand and politics on the other. And we have both, we can both benefit from that link. I am particularly honored to be with you this evening. LSE's Hellenic Observatory has done marvels over the years in serious research and serious and well-attended events. And I'm very happy and honored to be part of one of them once more. And of course, to discuss what is a very important contribution by a professor who is well known with an enormous publishing record behind him, and a very gifted teacher, as I hear from my own assistant in the office, who was his student at LSE, and now he has proven once more those gifts. And of course, with my friend Antigone, who I've known for a long time, and we are colleagues together at Panteion, that we will have the chance to discuss. Now, let me go directly into the juice of the matter. And let me start with I have 3-4 points. My first point has to do with the Trump effect. Obviously, there is a Trump swing compared to Mitt Romney, who represented, in a sense, the old school Republican, compared to Donald Trump's new age, new right, populist, anti-systemic right. And so the contrast between the two, 2012, 2016 elections, is stark and allow us to make some conclusions. But this Trump swing that gave Trump the victory was obviously exaggerated, magnified by a particular institution called the Electoral College, the extreme version of a very majoritarian electoral law, according to which the losses for the Democrats in those key swing states of Michigan and the rest were not compensated by the rise in Hillary Clinton's vote elsewhere. Those states might be losing populations, as Andrés said, but they did not necessarily lose. And there was a swing, but they did not necessarily lose the political weight they have in America. And this goes both for the Senate and for the presidential vote. It has been calculated that the Democrats have won the Senate overall, if one can calculate it this way, by 15 million votes, and nevertheless they are in minority. And of course, Donald Trump lost the popular vote by more than 3 million, and nevertheless managed to win the election, precisely because this Rust Belt swung by a few here and there, and this swing was exaggerated, magnified, overrepresented as a result in the Electoral College. This is my argument. And in that sense, in continental Europe, we are a little more secure because of the lack of this particular majoritarian system as compared to the US. The second point has to do with the threat to democracy, which is very debated, if there is an actual threat. There are those who might say that this populist stimulus has underlined the fact that politics matter, has increased interest in politics. We don't take politics for granted as something that is not affecting us, but it does have serious consequences for our everyday life, including the coronavirus. And so we are more mobilized, more motivated to participate. And in fact, there has been a rise in participation, in vote participation here and there, which is important to keep in mind. So as far as political participation, we don't see a threat rather than a amelioration. The second point about the threat to democracy is that a few scholars make the distinction between East and West. And they say that this populist challenge might be threatening in the Eastern democracies of Eastern Europe, places where, like Hungary, where institutions are weak, whereas, and democracy can be hijacked with constitutional changes and so on, as introduced by Viktor Orban, but not in the well-entrenched, consolidated, mature, advanced democracies of the West, where institutions can withstand these periodic waves of populism. Obviously, this is an open debate, and judging from the alarmist reporting from the US serious press, one cannot be so certain and so kind of relaxed. And already there are many, many clouds gathering over the forthcoming American elections, with the president not even declaring that he will concede. So it remains to be seen how much of a threat this whole thing is. Now, the serious research that was presented here to us speaks about one side of the equation. I might, if I were to be an economist, I am not, call it the supply side, the structural side of politics. But obviously, this is only one side of a much more complicated picture, and one has to must have to have in mind the other side and other things happening, which have to do and have been pointed out by scholars, other scholars, much more knowledgeable and into this than myself, has to do with cultural shifts, the rise of the internet, the way that we get our news today in a much more decentralized way, the collapse of respect for authority and for experts' opinion, and everything that has been changing the last 5, 10, 15 years. Very recently, if one considers that Facebook only started in 2005, only 15 years ago, and we have not yet been able to fully grasp what these cultural shifts have meant for our politics. And finally, there is obviously, apart from the supply or the demand side of politics, the structural and other factors. Obviously, there is the responsibility of politics and politicians, and nothing is predetermined. And so it depends on who the counter candidate is and what the counter message is and what we politicians do. The first, I would say, and I'm wrapping up, is that all this has to do, in a sense, with a bigger topic, which, if I were to be very brief, I would summarize it as the collapse of the left. The collapse of the left, the decline of the left, the center left, the left in Europe, in America, that has certainly allowed for the new right, extreme right, hard right, populist right, to hijack and to channel and to capitalize on the social discontent of the quote unquote, as Hillary Clinton famously and very, very costly called the deplorables, the deplorables. So the deplorables, the unprivileged, those without the problems, used to vote for the left. And this Rust Belt area of the US, the industrial heartland of the United States, places like Michigan, where the heart of the Democratic Party, of unionized labor, and that collapse of the left has made that shift to the strong right so much more prominent. And then obviously there are other
if you can wrap up.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
Other responsibilities of politicians, the crisis of the centrist politics of Blair and Clinton, Iraq, the debacle of 2008, and so on and so forth, that have allowed an opening for people like Trump to move in. So I would say there is this effect that Andrés has spoken about. It has been exaggerated by the Electoral College. It has been affected by cultural shifts, and it has to do with our responsibility as politicians as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitris. These are some excellent comments. I'll let Andrés respond to them after our second discussion, and then we'll open to the Q&A. Antigone, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Since I'm no longer a member of parliament, I shall skip all the niceties. But thank you, Andrea, very much for the stimulating talk, because the good thing is that it gives us food for thought. And I'm not going to pretend that I know very well the situation in the US, but I can tell you that from the point of view of where I'm standing, as a citizen of Greece, as a citizen of Europe, as a citizen of Southern Europe, it seems to me very, very important to find, to have a clearer picture and think hard about populism, about inequalities, about economic decline, and about lack of trust, or how to build trust. So in a sense, we in Greece are a very good audience, or at least group of people, to discuss these things, because we have been champions both in demographic decline and in economic decline, and over the long term. So somehow we should be able, since we've been there, to hypothesize what the next steps could be. To cut a long story short, I would like to suggest that the link between populism and economic decline and inequalities, but mainly economic decline, long-term decline, goes both ways. I see the point that long-term areas in long-term economic decline and demographic decline are prone to turn to populism, but we have an example in Greece where populism somehow arrested rates of growth, and I'm going to talk about it immediately later. The second point I would like to make is that populism is contagious, in the sense that it definitely does not belong only to the far right, and I would like to bring the discussion of populism in its broader sense, because it characterizes very well other ideologies apart from the extreme right. And the second is that it's not only about populism vis-a-vis trying to bridge the economic inequalities. It's populism also trying to throw stones to migrants and refugees. I mean, it is also another instance of populism. And so I would like to remind most of the speakers who are of a certain age that in the mid-70s, immediately after the dictatorship in Greece, we saw the meteoric rise of PASOK, a highly populist and very successful party whose main narrative was to include everybody into the project of development. I remember very clearly the non-privileged people. Everybody could fit into this category. And secondly, it was very aggressively nihilistic in terms of external policy. I wish to remind you the plea to sink the Turkish ship Hora, all the narrative against the European community, NATO and stuff. Of course, when PASOK came to power, it moderated part of the narrative. But on the issue of giving injections of transfers of money transfers to the people who were definitely not haves, and some of the haves also, it somehow addressed the issues that supposedly can bring about an increase in populism. The problem is, of course, that like every other populist party, PASOK was very uninterested as to where the money came from. So the money came from borrowing, internal and external. It came from European Community funds, which were designed for other purposes. And it also came from printing money and creating inflation. I'm saying this because I want to say that this was a populist instance, which we very rarely remember now, because first of all, we think that populism, as we talk about it now, is about Orban and Trump, and not about other nicer people. And the second is because I think that it has instilled some behaviors in our political system, namely the idea that while in opposition, it is a good thing to be a populist in order to get into the office. And as soon as you become a government, you moderate your narrative, and you pass the torch of populist critique and outbursts to the other party who is in the opposition. We saw this happening between PASOK and Nea Demokratia, between Nea Demokratia and Syriza, between Syriza and Nea Demokratia now. So they pass the torch, and it is somehow tolerated that as long as you are seriously playing the political democratic game, you need to become populist before the elections in order to be elected, in order to do the good things. Now, this has some very problematic aspects, and I want to ring the bell because I think this is an alarming, a silently alarming problem. The thing is that, of course, populists somehow are, they fall on they are inhibited by budget constraints, and they cannot distribute money à volonté. This happens when you are Greece or when you are a European country. It does not happen, of course, in the US, where you have your dollar and it's a different story. But I happen to speak on behalf of this part of the world. And as soon as any party, regardless of whether it is supposedly populist or not, gets into office, it somehow manages to steer the ship of the economy and the politics broadly within the European roadmap. But this has some collateral damage. First of all, the need to make reforms in the economy always comes as a hard landing that nobody wants, and of course not even the politicians who propose them, because they are made to make them. So nobody really thinks that reform is in any meaningful sense necessary. The other thing is that while losing the battle of the redistribution, because there is no money left, the Greek big parties make concessions to the other aspects of anger of their clientele. And this is anger versus refugees, anger versus immigrants, anger versus people who are different from themselves. And I think this is a very poisonous story that has to be told somehow. So populism is not only about far right, it is not only about trust, it is mainly about it is a very contagious game which migrates across parties, and it migrates across policy areas, economics, but also foreign policy. Our most recent sad example is the Prespes agreement, but there are others. And the idea that it doesn't matter, it is a vehicle for getting into office, and it doesn't matter if you are a nice guy, you can somehow play with populism, use it, and then do your own job. This is not happening. And in the end, all parties, all democratic parties will end up doing populists, the populists' job. And I am very alarmed with this idea. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Antigone. That's quite a pessimistic race to the bottom note. But Andrés, I will give you some time to respond to some of the points. I don't know if you need me to summarize the points. It's good. Okay, so I will give you a few minutes and then we'll pass it on to the floor for Q&As.
Thank you very much, Vasilis. And in the interest of time, I'll just, it's better for me to go directly. And thank you very much, Dimitris and Antigone, for a set of very, very interesting and incisive comments that I think complement very well, not just what's happening in the US, but also the situation that we are all undergoing in many parts of the developed world. Let me just start with some ideas. As Dimitris highlighted, the Electoral College creates enormous distortions in the US. Hillary Clinton won the vote, the popular vote, by more than 3 million. But because Trump won the key states in this Electoral College, he secured the presidency. This is a system that has been in place for a long time and is going to be almost impossible to reform. When you have that the state of Wyoming or Alaska, state of Wyoming with less than 600,000 people, Alaska 700,000, North Dakota 760,000, Rhode Island or Delaware with 1 million, they all have 2 senators, and that's the same as California with 40 million, or Texas with 29 million. Then you have that there's a system that distorts reality big time, and in a certain way, it distorts the sovereignty of the electorate. Having said that, it's a system that has been in place and hasn't changed for a long time, and all candidates knew about it and have known for some time. So the fact that Hillary Clinton, that spent significant amount of time, did not manage to sway a single of those states that matter, Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, or Wisconsin, it speaks volumes about the deep-seated discontent there, and the need to have, in a certain way, a more, let's say, territorially integrated level of intervention in certain parts of the country that for many years, and you mentioned the word deplorables that was actually put forward by Hillary Clinton, have been regarded as people living in places that no longer count, that they don't matter. This is something that needs to be addressed, and is something that, because the electoral system is unlikely to change, would require significant investment and significant capacity to change this long-term decline than what has been done until now. And let's remember that the US is the country, one of the countries in the world with Australia and New Zealand, where territorial disparities are the lowest. They are far more pronounced in a country like Greece or in a country like Spain or in the UK, which at the moment seems to be the country in Europe with the highest level of territorial inequality. On the question about this division between East and West, I would tend to agree. Yes, probably institutions and democratic institutions are far stronger in the West than they are in the East. And they can probably withstand a Donald Trump, or I'm going to be controversial here, or a Boris Johnson, or they can withstand perhaps a Salvini as Prime Minister of Italy. But nevertheless, the risk is there. It's not me that put the idea that democracy is at risk. When you read what the British Supreme Court said last year when Parliament was prorogued, and it deemed, the Supreme Court deemed that the prorogation of Parliament was unlawful, the words that were used was that it had stretched democracy to the limits. And this in the country, the UK, that is considered by many as the beacon of democracy. It's also the situation where if we have a sitting president of the US saying that he will abide by the decision of Americans at the election, depending on whether it suits him or not, more or less, as he said just yesterday, that is pushing democracy to the limit in many ways. So yes, it's true that our democratic institutions are strong, but they are becoming far more fragile than they ever were. And also the question of the robustness of institutions. We have seen a lot of institutions already collapse. Political parties, well-established political parties, you might say, well, maybe they needed to collapse. But in countries like France, in Italy, in Belgium, to a certain extent, in the case of Greece, the traditional party system that had been established and had been in place for quite some time has disappeared. And what it is being replaced by is no longer, I would say, and this is of course subject to debate, a cleavage that is left-right, but is a far more dangerous cleavage. Is, are you in favor of the system, or are you against the system? And this is where I link to Antigone's sort of comments on the question of what are the risks of being against the system. And what Antigone was saying is that there's a link between populism and decline, and this goes both ways, that decline can lead to populism, or populism can lead to decline. This is something that I would argue in the case of Europe and the US, we still have not seen, because we haven't had populist leaders in government for a long time to see whether it leads to decline. But we need to look at where it has happened. If you are Argentinian, you have been suffering populist leaders for the best of 30 years. Sorry, not the best of 30 years, since the 1930s, almost a century. And Argentina in 1920s was among the richest countries in the world, and look at where it is now. Thailand, that was the poster child of the IMF, the fastest growing Southeast Asian economy until the 1990s, but with huge territorial inequalities, the largest territorial inequalities in the world for the countries for which we got data, has been since the mid-1990s in a tug of war between populist candidates and an elite in Bangkok that has transformed a dynamic country into the worst performer in the whole of Southeast Asia. So I think you're right that there's a big risk, and we are in the West, in Europe and the US, we might undergo this risk. Because in the end, what anti-system and populist candidates are proposing are simple solutions to complex problems that might appeal in the short term, but in the long term are going to generate more significant problems than what we have. I'm going to try to link it to something, and this is where I might become a bit more emotional, but we have a system that is in need of reform, and is in bad need of reform, that is leaking in many places. But we have a system that across the Western world has generated the biggest level of prosperity, the biggest level of equality, interpersonal equality, and especially in the case of Europe, the longest period of peace that this continent has ever experienced. And throwing that away for something that in all likelihood is going to generate a worse outcome is something that we need to consider. Because as I said, the problem with this, and you highlighted it very well, Antigone, of populism is that it doesn't offer right solutions, and it creates enemies everywhere. Because I think there's a holy trinity of populists that very often link the right and the left. The holy trinity of populism is that you try to find enemies wherever they are. You're trying to find scapegoats wherever they are. And the first scapegoat is the elites. The problem is, who are the elites? And very often for these populist parties, left and right, is anyone who doesn't think like us. The second scapegoat, and this is important, is anyone who is outside our boundaries. It might be in the case of Europe, the European Union that is not delivering. In the case of the US, you have to pick a fight with whoever, with China, for example. And then the third one, which is the one that is probably more of a right-wing populism than a left-wing populism, is the one you highlighted, which is the one, those scapegoats, the people who are different from us. The migrants, the people of a different race, the refugees, that are people that can be picked on. in order to get the quick vote, despite the fact that you might be stoking tensions. So as I said, and I'm going to finish here, we have a system that is in bad need of reform, but probably what is being put in the horizon now as an alternative is a far worse alternative than trying to actually, through adequate public policy, address the problems that have led to the decline of the system and to where we are right now.
Right, thank you, Andrés. I'm afraid I won't give the opportunity for the discussants to discuss Andrés' responses. I want to move on to questions from the audience. I think I'm okay in trying to aggregate some of the questions. Let me first say that it's wonderful to see many people from many parts of the world, including some good colleagues at the University of Groningen, but also colleagues, former students in Greece, in the UK, somebody in Spain, but also somebody from Nepal, I think. So quite an international audience. I want to start, Andrés, by bringing some questions, two sets of questions from the audience. One concerns the theoretical explanation in your model. So Petros Kalliotis, a graduate from Queen Mary University here in London, says, why is social capital decline leading to a decline in the Trump margin and not the opposite? So if you want, what is your explanation of this, if you want, surprising effect? And then linked to that, if I can find another question, is a question in your view, what are the possible theoretical explanations for stronger human capital in decline areas to be a driver for populist voting? So why is, but I think the reference is here to social capital rather than...
Social capital rather than human capital,
yes. The question is human capital, but I think it is the social capital. So one is about the theoretical mechanism by these two, Javier Torero, an LSE student, and Skalliotis from Queen Mary. And then the other set of questions that I want to put to you, Andrés, is by Kalivas, Stefanos Kalivas, I think, which is more about why the decline, the population decline in these areas, as you mentioned the events of the places that don't matter. Why did it lead to populism and didn't lead to a higher demand for good policies? The question, I think, by Stefanos Kalivas is a bit more optimistic, saying, will we reach a time where the areas of decline, the backward states, would switch to demanding sound policy plans over populism, over populist rhetoric? And similarly, I think Babu Ali asked the same question, not the same question, but asked a question of why did it lead to populism and not to the support for the left, for socialism and Bernie Sanders? Why then populism and not a reclaim of the left? I hope these questions are grouped sufficiently well. Andrés, and I'll pass the floor to you.
Okay. Fine. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all the people making questions about the theoretical explanation of why strong social capital seems to be connected to populism and not the opposite, as Putnam. Here, I'm open to suggestions. I'm going to put on my theory, but it's something that is ongoing, and I think this is a phenomenon that requires significant analysis. But my explanation is that when you have a really fragmented society, when you have very strong social capital, there's low civic engagement, you don't participate with your neighbors, you don't engage with your neighbors, then your vote is mainly decided on other types of channels. It might be that these channels don't reflect the type of definition of social capital that was put forward by Putnam, that was mainly through association of individuals. And maybe people are associating online rather than associating like we are right now in person. But what I'll highlight is that when you have a strong social capital, when you have a strong civic participation, when you have a strong civic sense of community in communities that have been losing out, once decided, one person, one leader or part of the group or a certain part of the group decides that they're going to switch, that they have had enough of mainstream candidates, like Dimitris was saying, the idea of we don't want any more Mitt Romneys, we want someone who's going to finally shake the tree, then the whole community is going to shift, and you're going to see a massive shift happening in a relatively short amount of time. And this might be happening in the Rust Belts in the US, but it might be also happening in the Red Wall in the case of the UK. It might be happening, or it is happening, in the northeast of France, in parts of southern France, southeastern France. It's happening in still relatively rich but long-term declining communities of the north of Italy. The areas in Lombardia outside Milan, or many of the traditional small town rural areas of Veneto that have moved in big numbers to the Lega. Nevertheless, there would be a need to do a much more fine-tuned research in order to get the actual mechanisms. I think that the book I like the most about and this type of work is the book that was written by Kathy Kramer on, I think it was 2015 or 2016, on the case of Wisconsin, called Politics of Resentment. In this idea that you have groups that feel abandoned and therefore become resentful and decide that they are going to at least show and give the elite, whoever they are, a bloody nose. Second is, why is population decline and economic decline, so decline in general, not leading for a good demand of good policies and then shifting to populism? I'm not saying it's not leading for a good demand for a good policy, sorry. They might have been demanding policies for quite some time, but their plights have not been heard. In fact, I still remember when I was a young lad in Spain, and many of the areas that we're seeing industrial decline, people were coming out in droves saying the shipyard is closing. What we want is jobs, and we want real jobs. And you could see banners saying, we don't want to become waiters, we don't want to become civil servants. Nothing against civil servants. I am, after all, a civil servant. But that's what they wanted. What has been the reaction by most European societies, and I'm going to talk about the US later on, but now in Europe, has been to try to subsidize these places through transfers, through, in a way, inflating public employment, through big white elephants in terms of investment that look shiny, bigger motorways, for example, in the short term, but in the long term, don't bring any sort of impact for these places. And this can give you some traction for a short period of time. But when you see one party coming into office and then another party and then another party, and the same policies repeated over and over again, regardless of whether the party in office is a left-wing or right-wing party, at a certain point you said, that's enough. We no longer count, but we're going to show them that we count. In the United States, the problem is that very little has been done. Whereas in Europe, there was some transfers and there were some sort of activity. In the US, they were let to rot. And the idea was, why? These people should move. So if Ohio is declining, Youngstown in Ohio is declining, or if parts of Pennsylvania and Michigan are losing out, if Allentown in Pennsylvania is declining, these people should move where there's opportunity. The problem is many of these people cannot move because either they haven't got the skills, or they haven't got the capacity, or they haven't got the will, because they have their families, they have their social networks, they have their, they are rooted in the places of where they were born and where they have lived. So in that respect, they're saying, well, if we have no future, we are not going to be the only ones that are going to do it. And why support for populists and support for the left? I made a clear distinction. There are pro-system and anti-system parties. And many of those people that feel disenfranchised, they can be in rural declining towns, or they can be in cities. They are opting for anti-system parties. And this can be of the right and the left. In general, what we're seeing is that the shift to the right has happened outside the big cities, and with in places that have been declining and in places that have been aging in general. The shift to the anti-system left-wing populism is happening normally in younger groups within the cities. The issue is that perhaps at a certain point they might merge. Very often right-wing populism voters come from the right, left-wing populist voters come from the left, But we have seen in the past in many parts of Europe, mainly in France, a radical shift from extreme left communist parties and parties that emerged from the former Communist Party towards the former Front National. So very often the streams can, at a certain point, become joined in one way.
Right. We're quite running out of time, but I want to bring another set of questions, Andrés. One by Bernard Casey, former colleague and good friend, probably still a colleague, but now in Frankfurt. To what extent have you compared your work to that of Anne Case and Angus Deaton, to whom he listened yesterday? But I think, Andrés, the argument is about excess death rates, I think, for white white population without a college degree. And there's another question by Haider. I don't have the affiliation here, who says also, what is the role of education in the model? So maybe you can combine these things. So the white voters without education that are, or the areas with that margin of population that support now Trump. So that would be one question. Another set of questions would be in relation to whether other factors play a role. A couple of people, I have the names Korpakis and Ellis, have brought in Dimitris Korpakis, formerly of the European Commission in Brussels. To what extent globalization has played a role in the whole kind of decline of industrial areas? But also another question by Mr. Periklis Proinos and LSE alumnus, which links it to no, it's not Periklis Proinos, sorry, which links it to the declining power of the US in the international arena, so the political weight of the US internationally, and whether that explains the rise of populist politicians in the US more so than other things. So the argument by Case and Deaton, middle class and education, and also bigger processes, globalization, of course, but also international, the power of the US in the international arena.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the questions. How I made a connection between my analysis and the work of Case and Deaton that has, I became aware of it more recently, on excess death rates, the short answer is no, but I'm just going to try to link it. I think they're all part of the same, and I'm going to link it to education. When you have places that have been declining in the long run, and you have been losing employment, you see that the people that remain are very often the people that cannot move. The people that are dynamic, that have got the biggest capacity, that have got the highest level of better performance in high school, they move to college and then they move somewhere else. And the people that have got lower levels of education stay in environments where you see there are less jobs available, there's a bigger level of despair, and that leads to a lot of factors like, for example, substance abuse, alcohol abuse, that are far stronger among these groups than they were in the past in what were strong areas with social capital. And that is also linked in a way to issues like suicide, but also early deaths as a result of substance dependency and alcohol. So in fact, they are in parts of the same coin. When you feel that you have no future, that you're stuck in a place where you cannot move, or where even if you don't want to move, there are no opportunities, you're going to be feeling resentful and being unhappy as a result, is one factor behind early deaths and also behind the reaction at the ballot box. On the question by Dimitris Korpakis, thank you very much, Dimitris, whether globalization has played a role. I think it has played a role, and it has played an important role. The competition, especially many of these were all industrial areas that have been declined. That's why they're called, have been declining. They have not been able to withstand the competition from cheaper and very often same quality or higher quality produced from elsewhere in the world. And mainly this is what people like David Autor call the China effect, from places like China, but anywhere else in the world where they are produced, are the ones that are reacting. Having said that, I'm not saying that I'm anti-globalization. In fact, I'm a strong supporter of globalization, and I think we all win globally and within countries, as countries in general, from greater trade interaction, integration. Having said that, I do find that globalization strategies very often have failed to factor in who wins and who loses from greater trade integration and where these people are located. And very often you see that a never dwindling elite or group, I don't want to use the word elite, of individuals is reaping the lion's share. They are very often located in the most dynamic areas, that is the big cities or near the big cities, where swaths of territory, let's say in the north of Italy, in the north of France, in the north of England, in the Rust Belt in the US, have been losing out and have been losing out from this for a long time. So we need trade integration, but this trade integration has to be sensitive to who wins and who loses and where these people are located. So it has to have a territorial dimension included. And then the question of whether the decline in the political arena and the decline of power of the US is causing this reaction, I think it's also a reaction that is important. Economic causes are not just the only causes behind the rise of anti-system voting. There are there's a lot of work on identity and psychology, etc., and the cultural factors. The idea that the UK was one of the biggest powers, France was a great power, the US is still the greatest power, but is losing, seems to be less capable of shaping the way the world is seen and perceived, and the way the world works is clearly a factor behind the rise of populism. The question is, why is this concentrated in certain parts of the country and not in others? And that's where I think this long-term economic decline and population decline factor plays a fundamental role that it wouldn't, that doesn't pan out or doesn't appear in the most dynamic places.
I think we running a bit out of time, so I cannot obviously take all the questions that are asked, but I'll put a last round to you, Andrés. So two sets of questions. One is about the comparability of your results for the case of Europe. A couple of people have asked that. Pericles Posidonos, a former student of ours, actually, to what extent the results translate to the case of Europe. And another question related to that is that we know that inequalities seem to have played a role in the case of Europe. Well, that's, I guess, an open question. How can we explain that they don't, in your analysis, they don't seem to play such a role in the US? I think interpersonal inequalities is the reference. So this is, and also how the results translate also to your conclusions to the case of Brexit, of the Leave vote in the UK. Another question, perhaps more closing, is a couple of people have asked if populism is bad and why are we concerned with populism? And there's also a question by Peter Aspden from the Financial Times, I think, where he says, what is the difference between a populist and a popular policy? Is there a moral dimension to this distinction? So maybe I will leave also this question to, after you answer Andrés, to allow our discussants to very quickly also say a few words about that. Is populism bad? What is the distinction with popular and populist? Andrés, the floor back to you.
Okay. Comparability of the results to Europe. I think the results, if you're interested in this, there's a paper called The Geography of EU Discontent, which was written by Louis Dijkstra, Hugo Pullman, and myself, and was published this year, in which we do the same analysis. And in fact, what we find is that many of the factors like density, levels of education, aging, in the case of Europe, is not race, but other factors are very similar in terms of what's happening in the US and in Europe. In terms of economic decline, they both play an important role. I think that is one of the key roles. So long-term economic decline drives populism and anti-system voting in Europe, as it does in the US, although the factors differ. In the US is population decline and employment decline. In Europe is decline in GDP and decline in industrial output and industrial employment more than any other type of employment decline. So why is that? Possibly because we have a bigger safety net in Europe, in which, whereas in the US until very recently, and there are now calls by people with no risk of being called socialists like Ed Glaser or Larry Summers to subsidize these places. In Europe, we have been doing this for the last 50, 60 years. And that has prevented the free fall that has been seen in many of the American areas. So it's a different type of decline that seems to be behind the rise of populism and anti-system voting in Europe and in the US. On the comparability of the results in terms of interpersonal inequalities and the idea that interpersonal inequalities are driving the rise of populism in Europe, I wish I had the data. I mean, I cannot say that that's the case, because that's something that, at least from a territorial perspective, we don't have data on interpersonal inequalities at subnational level in Europe. So it's very difficult at the moment to establish whether that is the case. We have better data in the case of the US. Having said that, I do think that probably the phenomenon at the moment is not that different. In fact, I would, if you were to push me, I would say that interpersonal inequalities are driving the rise of, and this happened within mainly regions, not across regions. So they would be within cities, are driving the rise of left-wing populism rather than right-wing populism at the moment, which is much more linked to long-term economic decline. But this is something that needs to be studied and needs to be studied more. And then on the final question of whether what is populist and what is popular here, what is a popular policy? Well, a popular policy, it's very difficult for me to say, and I would probably refer to the definition of populism by Casmuda. But for me, a popular policy would be one that manages to generate welfare for all. In the end, a populist policy would be one that stokes confrontation to benefit a particular group within society that is actually supporting that option vis-a-vis what would be in the end the great majority of the population, and therefore end up with a suboptimal result and with a lower welfare returns from that policy overall.
Thank you, Andrés. Antigone, would you like to add something on this question about popular and populist?
Yeah, gladly. Okay, it's a very, of course, it's a question that we could spend weeks discussing, but to me, populism is appalling because it is about closed systems of ideas. It is about anger. It is about hostility to change. It is about a complete passivity vis-a-vis building your own life. And I think this is terribly poisonous, and this is why I think that politicians should never ever appeal to this kind of instincts that keep people stuck in the mud and don't let them develop their capabilities. That's it.
Quick. Dimitri, we're just running out of time, but if you can take 20 seconds to give your take on that.
There is so much that can be said. I think the importance of the paper and Andrés' work is to highlight that there is some serious causes, some serious base for the Trump phenomenon that is often dismissed as ephemeral, as a usurper by the serious press. And I think it highlights the need to go down and do the research and understand exactly the social causes that give rise to this phenomena. That's point number one. Point number two, obviously, there are so many interconnections that one can draw. The rise of China and the decline of the Rust Belt and of certain areas in the West that depended on industry and trade and have been so negatively affected and have led to that decline in population and immigration. Very important. These connections between in and out of borders. Obviously, the right wing has been...
I think we have to leave it there. Thank you very much. Let me take the point to thank all the participants, the audience for their questions, and also, of course, to thank our keynote speaker, Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, and our two discussants, Dimitris, Kairidis, and Antigone, Lyberaki. Thank you for joining this Hellenic Observatory and National Bank of Greece lecture, and we hope to see you all in future events. Thank you very much to our speakers, and good night.
Yeah. Okay.